I'm Tracy Carluccio, Deputy Director of Delaware Riverkeeper Network. Our organizations are here today to share lessons we've learned from the Pennsylvania grand jury. Pennsylvania's 43rd statewide investigating grand jury report on the unconventional oil and gas industry drew conclusions about the impacts that the fracking boom has had on the environment and on the health of those who live and work in proximity to fracking and its operations in Pennsylvania. One conclusion drawn over and over, based on the evidence examined by the grand jury, is that fracking pollutes water, including drinking water from people's water wells, pollutes air, and has made people sick. Entire families living near fracking operations have become ill. The scathing report is deeply critical of Pennsylvania's institutions that were responsible. They were responsible for enforcing regulations, implementing safeguards, and responding to the public and to the pollution caused by the industry. Department of Environmental Protection, the Department of Health, and government overall are exposed in this report for the damage done to the people burdened with the multiple injuries that accompanied fracking and its operations, and the environmental destruction that persists today. We are speaking at this forum to the commissioners of the Delaware River Basin Commission, the governors of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and to the federal representative, the Army Corps of Engineers. There is currently a de facto moratorium on fracking in the Delaware River Basin. You are considering natural gas regulations that would permanently ban fracking in the Delaware River watershed, which is essential, but would also allow frack wastewater to be brought into the watershed and stored, treated, and discharged here, and would allow water to be withdrawn here to fuel fracking outside the basin. Simply put, it is not logical to ban fracking and allow the pollution and water resource depletion caused by fracking to occur anyway. All of it must be banned. The draft regulations were proposed in 2017 with a public comment period that ended in March 2018. Tens of thousands of people wrote to DRBC during that time and testified at hearings on the draft regulations calling for a full ban on fracking, prohibiting fracking, wastewater discharges, and the export of water for fracking. We are approaching 3 years since you passed that resolution for a ban, but incomprehensibly, no final action has been taken. Over 100,000 petitions, they were delivered to you, the DRBC commissioners in 2018, calling for the vote for a full ban. We have spoken to you at every DRBC public comment session since you closed the official comment period to keep you abreast of the hundreds of scientific reports, environmental and health research papers, and the growing body of evidence regarding fracking and its unavoidable and devastating impacts. The grand jury's findings provide the rationale for a ban on fracking everywhere, and the report certainly makes clear that fracking should not be allowed to expand further into areas now frack-free. We are here today to share with each of you commissioners how the report amplifies and provides on-the-ground evidence for the specific issues that we have brought to you over the years, affirming the pressing need for a full ban on fracking. Speaking today in the order of presentation are representatives of organizations from throughout the Delaware River watershed, collectively representing hundreds of thousands of members. Doug O'Malley, Director of Environment, New Jersey. Jeff Tittel, Director of New Jersey Sierra Club. Wes Gillingham, Associate Director, Catskill Mountainkeeper. Eric Benson, Campaign Director, Clean Water Action. Coralie Pryde, retired chemist and environmental activist, Wilmington, Delaware. Eric Weltman, Senior Organizer, Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Action. Barbara Arrindell, Director, Damascus Citizens for Sustainability. I'll turn it over to you first, Doug. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tracy. And thank you to all of our allied organizations that are joining us on the phone and on this video today. We're here because we love this great river and this watershed, and it deserves the strongest possible protections possible. And the actions that cause fracking to pollute the air and water in Pennsylvania are an environmental crime that we do not want to see repeated. This includes fracking to extract shale gas, but also includes pollution from waste produced by fracking. And this should be a warning to every state in the Delaware River watershed. This is not Las Vegas. What happens in Pennsylvania and what happens in Pennsylvania is not guaranteed to stay in Pennsylvania. We live in a watershed, not just around one state. In fact, according to the grand jury report, and I quote, "The dangerous chemicals used to drill and hydraulically fracture unconventional wells end up in drill cuttings and millions of gallons of wastewater produced by each individual well. Managing the millions of gallons of wastewater generated by unconventional oil and gas operations, in particular, presents an extremely challenging problem. The fracking industry has never had a good solution for this problem, and it persists today." End of quote. This is from page 19, but let me repeat that last sentence from the grand jury report. The fracking industry has never had a good solution for this problem, and it persists today. We, members of this organization and members of the public, many of us and many of our organizations attended the public hearings on this way back in the winter of 2018. Even up in Wayne County, there was a vast public outcry, not from the industry, but from the public saying, do not move forward with these regulations unless you have a complete ban on all fracking activities. As Tracy said, the public responded to this comment period by submitting more than 100,000 comments to DRBC criticizing the process and methods proposed in the draft gas regulations for the treatment and disposal of frack wastewater that were supported by this finding of the grand jury. DRBC uses these exact EPA tables from the agency's technical document on oil and gas waste discharges to define the pollutants of concern. However, there are only 78 pollutants listed in the EPA table, while numerous current analyses show that there are over 1,000 additives are in the fluids used to frack wells today. Let me repeat that again. 78 pollutants listed in the EPA table, but there are over 1,000 additives used in the fluids used to frack wells currently. We do not want the secret sauce of the industry polluting our drinking water, whether it be in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, or Delaware. New York DC, in addition, has tested frack wastewater from the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania and West Virginia and found 154 parameters. Many of these frack fluids are toxic and are of harmful health effects for humans or fish, wildlife, and plant life. Some are carcinogenic. We reiterate our warning that DRBC will not be able to safely dispose of frack wastewater, and by attempting to do so, you are risking the future water supply of up to 17 million people. This is a lesson learned from the grand jury.
Thank you, Doug. This is Jeff Tittel, Director, New Jersey Sierra Club, and I'm here representing our 100,000 supporters and over 23,000 members, but more importantly, the 4 million members and supporters nationwide, because this is the front line in the battle against fracking and the battle for a clean environment and clean air and clean water as well. And as someone who lives right by the Delaware River, I can tell you that the river has got its problems, but it's been getting cleaner and cleaner over the years. And, you know, it's a place where everyone can come and enjoy tubing and kayaking or, you know, walk around the canal or path of the river itself. And the biggest threat to this river is fracking and fracking waste and the impact it could have on the basin. And that's why it's so critical after all these years. It's been over 10 years since the moratorium went in effect that they make it permanent. And it's been so many years since we went to all these hearings where we got commitments from different governors to call for a full fracking ban, including fracking waste water and what's water withdrawal, but it still hasn't been adopted. And that's why I think this grand jury report is so troubling, because it really shows the mismanagement and misdeeds by the Pennsylvania DEP when it comes to dealing with fracking and the consequential environmental impacts. This is what happens when you take away force from enforcement, when The people who are supposed to be regulating those industries instead have a cozy relationship with the industry they're supposed to regulate. They don't have proper training, or they just look the other way. You don't always know what's the cause. Is it incompetence? Is it deliberate? But it doesn't really matter. The outcome is the same, which is more pollution in our water, more air pollution, more wells contaminated, more forests cut down, and so many other impacts. And that's why this grand jury report is so critical and so scathing at the same time, because after interviewing Pennsylvania DEP employees and impacted residents, the grand jury noted concern that the role of industry influence may have played with DEP's delayed actions to the arrival of unconventional drilling, meaning fracking. In other words, they looked the other way. They buried their head in the sand, whatever you want to call it. But this allowed for more accidents and spills and contamination to happen. This cozy relationship between DEP, the PADEP and the fracking industry impacted the environment, water supply, and the public, and even people's health. And that's what's so critical, because the grand jury acknowledged that some of DEP actions may have had some legitimate policy decisions, but they noted the DEP failed to meet its mission to protect Pennsylvania's air, land, and water from pollution and to provide for a healthy and safe, for the health and safety of its citizens. And this is directly out of the grand jury report. It means that the DEP was not only a rubber stamp to the industry, in some cases they were a cheerleader, and they interpreted the rules and regulations to benefit the fracking industry, when they could have taken even a stricter or harder line, or even followed the rules and regulations where they looked the other way in so many cases. And this led to bigger environmental impacts and more damage to groundwater, more pollution. And really, it's just one of the most shameful things in Pennsylvania history, when the people who are supposed to enforce the law basically side with the industry. The other issue that was raised in the grand jury report was that many of the training opportunities for DEP employees over the years did not focus on fracking. In several years, the grand jury notes there was little or no training at all. Also, many employees did not seem to take training opportunities that did arise and seemed to be discouraged from doing it, both in earlier and recent years. In many cases, it shows they were just sympathetic to the industry, or they didn't really care about what would happen to the public or to the environment. They really, in a way, violated their oath of office by not taking the training to learn about the potential impacts and the rules and regulations and that guide what they should be doing. What I find even worse is that citizen complaints, and this comes directly out of the report again, citizen complaints and spill cases were commonly resolved with DEP employees without ever inspecting the spills in person. Many times they would call the well site operator and they would close the case based on a photo or based what the well operator told them. In many cases, they hardly ever even responded to the people who were making the complaints, the people who pay their salaries, the people of Pennsylvania who were impacted by fracking or saw spills or violations that DEP refused to enforce or looked away or didn't even come out and inspect. The lack of transparency, the lack of oversight, and the lack of any accountability is why the fracking industry in Pennsylvania has created so many toxic sites and have polluted so many wells in so many areas of the state. And when you give a polluter a holiday, you end up having more violations. When the people who are in charge of enforcement look the other way, you end up having more environmental problems, not less. And this is a clear lesson from the grand jury report. On the ground implementation and fully trained operational oversight is essential, as demonstrated by the grand jury report. And so the point that I want to make here, if we don't have a full ban, including for fracking and fracking waste, the DRBC itself lacks the resources, the training, the experience to implement any regulations. They don't have the ability to do the inspections or the staff to enforce special regulations on operators such as fracking waste processing or on where that waste even gets shipped, let alone, the impact at those facilities. The DRBC would need a lot of funding and training and to do inspection, enforcement, and oversee the new fracking activities, but they haven't addressed it. They don't have the resources, they don't have the personnel, and they cannot rely on the Pennsylvania DEP because we know they've looked the other way. Again, we see all across the country when the police do not do their job or those who are in charge of enforcement do a job, what ends up happening. In this case, it's the drinking water for 17 million people that's at risk. It's tens of thousands of acres of open space, and it's the health impacts to all the people along the region, as well as the tourist-based economy for a lot of the region. Those are lessons learned from the grand jury report.
Hello, my name is Wes Gillingham, Associate Director of Catskill Mountainkeeper. The grand jury report delves into the problems with air pollution from various aspects of shale gas development. The human health effects for those exposed has been devastating. This report, I'm quoting from the report now, Pennsylvania's laws further aggravate the problem by not accounting for the aggregate effects of fracking operations. When numerous gas sites exist in a relatively small area, their collective effect is not measured or acknowledged in the governing regulatory scheme. Owners described living near a combination of well pads, pigging stations, gas processing plants, compressor stations, and impoundments. The DEP regulates these sites only individually, however, and by each individually company associated with them. Therefore, 2 oil and gas companies may own and operate adjacent pigging stations, but so long as each is compliant with emissions limits, Pennsylvania law is met. Meanwhile, a nearby homeowner is exposed to the collective effect of the emissions from both pigging stations in addition to other nearby well pads and industry operations. But there is no recognition of the heightened risk posed by the collective emissions from multiple sites. That's from the grand jury report on page 40. To protect people from oil and gas emission, that means to protect people from getting a dose of a toxic exposure. The higher the risk of damage from a toxic exposure causes illness and potentially death. Collective impacts, as stated in the report, or what the science and medical community calls cumulative impact, is it shows in the literature that this can be additive, not just additive, but synergistic, with multiple exposures causing far more harm than simply the sum of the risks. The Attorney General points to the heart of the issue in Pennsylvania in that the regulations of Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection should address all the sources of oil and gas emissions in an area and not just the single sites. While the DRBC is proposing to ban fracking, which eliminates well pads as a source of air pollution, many other sources of fracking-related air pollution could be installed in the basin under the proposed gas regulations. Storage, processing, treatment, discharge of water. This reminds me of the very beginning of the fight against fracking in New York State. We looked at the current regulations that existed in 2007 and 2008. And in the generic environmental impact statement for New York, it said, due to the nature of gas drilling, there's relatively no cumulative impacts. That was one of the major reasons that legislators across New York, and including Governor Patterson, decided that New York's regulations were outdated and needed to be entirely revamped. That started a 7-year process that culminated on addressing cumulative impacts by banning fracking and banning it on the base of those health impacts, exactly like the Attorney General's report points out and highlights. Waste treatment facilities, processing plants, storage deposits, and tanks resulted in serious health problems for those in proximity. This whole process, by taking these problems and looking at a regulatory scheme that controls this air pollution, by recognizing the cumulative impacts, this would bring New York or Pennsylvania's regulations up to the 21st century. But that simply is not what is happening here. That is not the regulations that currently exist in Pennsylvania. And this is the lesson that we learned from the grand jury's report.
My name is Eric Benson from Clean Water Action, Campaign Director. The grand jury report extensively documents the stories of people whose health has been harmed by fracking operations and their lives upended by the heavy industrial processes involved in the various stages of gas development. And the report quotes, while each homeowner's experience was unique, they were in many ways similar, regardless of whether they lived in the same township or hundreds of miles from one another. Indeed, many of their accounts were remarkably consistent. Dozens of people experienced the same medical symptoms in association with the same oil and gas activity. Parents invariably feared what exposure to fracking operations posed to their children's health and future as any parent would. There are simply too many people who have suffered similar harms in communities throughout Pennsylvania where fracking occurs to disregard the damage caused by this industry's operations. This reality necessitates laws and regulations capable of protecting those put at risk by fracking and a government willing to enforce them. For too long, Pennsylvania has failed to live up to its responsibility to its people in both respects, and that's from the report on page 22. The report also describes the degradation that people have experienced who live in proximity to not only the frack wells, but also storage facilities, impoundments, and other fracking-related operations. The report quotes, they could not sell their home, however, because it was unsafe, but also could not afford the cost of maintaining their mortgage and paying to live somewhere else. Thus, they were stuck with the option of financial ruin or trying to carry on living in a home where they feared for their health and their long-term well-being of themselves and their children. These were decisions born from desperation, and several homeowners shared with us the heartbreaking moment they realized they had no option but to leave. That's from the report on page 43. The public has presented to the DRBC peer-reviewed reports and literature reviews that have been published in recent years regarding the health effects of fracking operations on Pennsylvania's communities where fracking has occurred. Last year, we submitted the 6th edition of the Compendium of Scientific Reports regarding the impacts of fracking to the DRBC. Also submitted is a report examining and categorizing the fracking-related health studies on Pennsylvania. During the public comment period on the draft gas regulations concerned health professionals of New York, the Physicians for Social Responsibility in New York submitted their comments, collection of comments of their most up-to-date scientific literature regarding fracking impacts to the DRBC. Their cover letter stated, the Compendium of Scientific, Medical, and Media Findings Demonstrating Risks and Harms of Fracking, from which the attached document is drawn, compiles a significant and rapidly accumulating body of evidence demonstrating that fracking and all frack activities, including wastewater spills and disposal practices, pose serious risks to the water contamination and harm to public health. To protect the Delaware River watershed, we urge you to prohibit drilling and fracking, as well as all associated activities, including importation of wastewater, its disposal, and water withdrawal. One very clear conclusion of the grand jury reports is that there has been a steep price paid by communities in terms of public health and the welfare of families for the fracking that has occurred and the wastewater that has resulted. These externalized costs will continue to accrue to the public as fracking continues. DRBC has been warned that allowing the expansion of fracking into the Delaware River Basin will burden the same heavy costs on communities here. This is a lesson learned from the grand jury.
The grand jury also pointed out that one of the most difficult and dangerous aspects of the wastewater produced by fracking is the produced water that slowly returns to the surface while the well is in production. In addition to the immediate flow back, you also get this other fluid, and it is highly contaminated wastewater that drillers must dispose of or reuse right away. What the jury said is, in addition to gas, wells expel produced water, which consists of fracking fluid that did not initially exit the well as flowback, but steadily exits a well during production. Because produced water has remained in the subsurface far longer than flowback, it is more contaminated and will typically contain high levels of sodium chloride or salt, bromide, lithium, boron, iron, manganese, arsenic, and radioactive radium. An unconventional well can produce from 500,000 to over 3.5 million gallons of flowback and produced water over the first 5 to 10 years of production. And that was from the grand jury report, page 15. The public submitted extensive information to DRBC during the comment period and later, showing how naturally occurring radioactive materials, or NORM, N-O-R-M, is not only in produced water, as the grand jury states, but in flowback and frac wastewater as well. It has also been found in brine from conventional gas wells. Brines have been used as a de-icer or a dust suppressor on roadways, so radioactive materials can wash into streams nearby. NORM can be trapped in drill cuttings and residual solids too, so that's another disposal problem. It is well known that the Marcellus Shale Formation has high levels of radioactive material compared to many other shale formations. Wastewater contaminated with radioactivity is unavoidable. When radioactive materials are not disposed of properly, there is a chance that the public will be exposed, raising concerns about higher levels of cancer in such populations. Documents submitted to the DRBC show that sampling by New York State detected radiological materials in the Marcellus Shale flowback. These included radium-226, the longest lived isotope of radium, and with a half-life of 1600 years. Alpha particles from radium-228 and beta particles from 226 were measured to determine the ratio of the two different radium isotopes and to get a better understanding overall of what the radioactivity is in these shales. Since Pennsylvania drillers routinely recycle or reuse fracking wastewater to frack the next well, each time the water is used, all the contaminants, including radioactive ones, become more and more concentrated. The result of this concentration is T-norm, or technically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive materials. Fracked wastewater containing T-norm is not being properly monitored by either the federal government or the states. We need effective regulations requiring monitoring and testing for T-norm at crucial junctures in the whole waste stream. In many situations, radium and other radionuclides cannot be removed from wastewater in any cost-effective manner. All contaminated material needs to be disposed of as highly hazardous. This is not always done. If DRBC allows fracking waste imports and disposal, extreme efforts will be needed to ensure that radioactive waste do not get into our water bodies. Policies such as allowing some fracking waste to be added to municipal waste dumps are not safe. Radioactivity levels may actually rise in these waste pits, and also radioactive material may leach out of these waste pits and eventually into our streams. We must not allow the DRBC to make us a dumping ground for these wastes. They will eventually end up in the Delaware River and the Delaware Bay. They will stay there forever, really, and they can bioaccumulate from the small microorganisms up through the entire food chain until they affect the big fish that we do sport fishing for, or the fish that we eat, and the birds that people come to Delaware to watch. This whole risk to our health and our industries is just too great. And this is a lesson we have learned from the grand jury.
My name is Eric Weltman, and I'm a New York-based senior organizer with Food and Water Action. We're pleased to join our allies today to send a message to Governor Cuomo and the other DRBC commissioners. We need a complete ban on fracking in the Delaware River Basin to protect our water, communities, and environment. The grand jury exposed one of the industry's worst secrets regarding the lack of disclosure of the chemicals that are involved in fracking and frack wastewater based on a special exemption. This quote from the grand jury report highlights the industry's disturbing and dangerous exemption from the Community Right to Know Act. Quote, remarkably, the shale gas industry, despite using and transporting dangerous chemicals in their everyday operations, is largely excused from SARA Title III's oversight regime. No other industry enjoys such comparable exemptions. Because of these federal exemptions, the states almost exclusively govern the fracking industry's obligations to publicly dispose of the dangerous chemicals it uses. In Pennsylvania, the industry self-reports and publicly posts the chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing in an unconventional well on a website called Frack Focus. Continuing from the grand jury report, there is a significant gap in reporting, however, because the industry is not obligated to identify or provide information about chemicals they classify as trade secrets. They must disclose trade secret chemicals to the DEP. The public and first responders cannot access them. Keeping these proprietary chemicals secret leaves firefighters and hazmat teams incapable of effectively or safely responding to emergencies at unconventional gas sites. Communities, industry employees, and others who find themselves in close proximity are likewise kept in the dark. This risk is unacceptable. Only full public disclosure is sufficient. This, a direct quote from the grand jury report. We, the public, presented to the DRBC during a public comment session at a DRBC business meeting the findings of an extensive report, Keystone Secrets, authored by the Partnership for Public Integrity. This report delved into the exemption that the grand jury highlighted by documenting that drilling companies have extensively used exemptions in Pennsylvania rules that allow companies to withhold chemical identities as trade secrets. Drilling companies injected secret fracking chemicals 13,632 times into 2,515 unconventional wells in Pennsylvania between 2013 and 2017, primarily in the Marcellus and Utica shale formations. The companies injected at least one hydraulic fracking chemical with an identity kept secret from the public into 55% of the more than 4,500 unconventional gas wells drilled in the state during the 5-year period. Each well received an average of more than 5 secret chemical injections. Some of these secret chemicals are toxic and have well-known adverse health effects. What makes it even more difficult for the public to access fracking chemical information is that if chemical manufacturers, as opposed to other companies involved in fracking, assert the trade secret claims, then Pennsylvania law appears to allow no one to learn the chemicals' identities, even in the case of a leak or spill. The exemption relieves chemical manufacturers of the duty to report the chemicals in their fracking fluid products to the public. Regulators such as DEP, emergency personnel, and first responders, health professionals, and even well operators using the products. The commission and operators of centralized waste treatment facilities in the Delaware River Basin would also be deprived of this information. This problem is an obvious hindrance for managing spills and leaks for both regulators and emergency responders, but it also renders the DRBC's draft natural gas regulations ineffective because the proposed acute and chronic toxicity testing cannot measure what is unknown. Without knowing what is in the waste, accurate effluent testing cannot be done. DRBC will be in the same situation as every other agency, left in the dark without the ability to prevent pollution and contamination of our precious water resources and environmental habits. This is a lesson learned from the grand jury.
I'm Barbara Arrindell, Director of Damascus Citizens for Sustainability in Wayne County, PA. The grand jury pointed out that fracking wastes enjoy federal exemptions that make it easier and cheaper for these companies to dispose of waste. The exemption that allows frack wastewater to be handled as if it is not hazardous, even though it contains hazardous materials, has led to unwarranted damages due to unsafe handling and disposal. Pollution incidents in PA expose people and the environment to avoidable hazards. From the grand jury report, quote, "This wastewater may be composed mostly of brine and relatively harmless constituents, or it may be full of extremely dangerous chemicals or highly radioactive. There is no way to tell, however, because the industry is not required to identify or manage its wastewater for what it actually contains. Due to exemptions under federal law, trucks carrying fracking wastewater in Pennsylvania are not placarded as hazardous waste, even though they may be carrying hazardous waste." This is from page 2021 of the report. 5 of the grand jury's 8 conclusions of harms are related to exemptions held by oil and gas from major provisions of 7 protective laws: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Community Right to Know Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, and much more. We submitted public comments to the DRBC so they know about these exemptions, including about the hazardous waste loophole that renamed the waste as special. As special, waste generated from oil and gas exploration and production are exempt from regulation under Subtitle C, Hazardous Waste Management of RCRA, and exempt from RCRA's cradle-to-grave oversight of toxic hazardous materials. The exemptions reduce the company's expenses while removing their liability for environmental and public health damages the company's waste cause, placing that liability on the local and downstream communities. Because it is labeled special does not mean that it's not toxic. It is toxic, and many of the chemicals in it are very harmful, even in tiny amounts when they act as hormones. For example, studies of humans and of horses show that exposure to this chemical-laden waste causes increased birth defects and cancers, among other impacts. Allowed releases will include harmful contaminants. The Delaware River should not be treated as a sewer. The EPA agrees in a 2018 report that the wastewater has negative impacts on water quality, aquatic life, and potentially public health, with harm that can persist for years. EPA also shows that the likelihood of spills increase as the volume of wastewater and number of trips increase. The increased volume of wastewater produced today from much longer well bores is larger than DRBC predicted in its draft regulations analysis. This means substantial risk of pollution from spills, accidents, and deliberate dumping if wastewater were to be transported into the Delaware River Basin for treatment and disposal. In the draft gas regulations, DRBC has not acknowledged the occurrence of spills, accidental releases, and dumping that will occur, and proposes no plan to prevent the waste spills and accidents that are so prevalent elsewhere. The DRBC proposes no special hazardous waste handling. Why would they propose to importing these poisons? To whose benefit? DRBC's job is to protect the basin from just this type of harm. DRBC would be unnecessarily opening the watershed to hazardous frack waste if the draft gas regulations are enacted with federal exemptions intact. Only New York State has recently changed that. Of course, what would be better is to keep the current prohibition on frack waste disposal. The dangers of pollution from improper and unsafe waste disposal, transportation accidents, spills, and dumping cannot be tolerated, as they are a threat to the environment, water resources, and public health. This is a lesson learned from the grand jury.
So thank you, commissioners, for hearing what we have learned from Pennsylvania's 43rd statewide investigating grand jury. We present these reflections on the report's findings to support our ongoing call for you to vote for a permanent ban throughout the Delaware River watershed, a ban on fracking, a ban on frack wastewater storage, processing, and discharge, and a ban on water exports for fracking elsewhere. Regarding the Pennsylvania grand jury report, we want to highlight the necessity for accountability for the heavy burden of damage that has occurred due to fracking in Pennsylvania. Those responsible include the industry, agencies, and government. And it must be recognized that people were in positions of authority and power that spurred on the fracking frenzy, despite the harm. It seems right that the damage done be atoned for by DEP and by the Department of Health, by Pennsylvania's governing bodies, by the industry, and by those in the legislature who supported the industry's unbridled greed. The damage done since the fracking boom began remains and will be the legacy of those who were in authority. DRBC should realize and listen to this. So many people were harmed. Some have died. Some have families' lives that have been torn apart. Farms have been ruined. So much indelible environmental damage has been inflicted on the Commonwealth by the self-serving interest of the fracking industry, their supporters, and those who look the other way. The truth is, future generations will not be able to forget it because they won't be able to escape it. As we, the public, have spoken at DRBC meetings since 2017 and for a decade prior to that, fracking and its activities must be prevented in order to protect the drinking water for 17 million people, including New York City and Philadelphia, and to defend the unmatched natural assets and living communities, human and non-human, of the wild and scenic Delaware River and the National Estuary. The pressures of the fracking industry are never ending, and we, as a watershed community, want the debate to end with DRBC making the right decision, the decision you, the commissioners, know is the only protective one for our watershed, and that is to ban fracking and its activities completely. Ban frack wastewater, ban frack water withdrawals, and ban fracking throughout the Delaware River watershed. Thank you for your time today.